Do you want to host and record a podcast interview and aren't quite sure how to create a natural, relaxed yet engaging conversation? In this video, I'll give you 5 simple tips on how you can significantly optimize the quality of your interviews. Hello, my name is Kurt Wojcicki. I am the owner of Kurt Creative, a 100% digital content marketing company. Among other things, we specialize in producing podcasts for companies, and our customers often come to us and ask us how we can ensure that our interviews sound natural, that they sound authentic, and that the listener has the feeling that 2 very exciting, interesting people are really talking about a topic, which is, of course, just as interesting at best. The first tip I always give my clients is to make it feel like a natural conversation. Of course, that's easier said than done. Many people want to be well prepared for their interviews and have already worked out a lot of questions in advance, perhaps even alternative questions if certain topics are somehow not so exciting or not so productive. And in all this preparation, many people forget what an interview is actually about. Namely, that you can create a vibe between 2 people, that it is a conversation that is fun for both of them, that is appealing and interesting for both of them. The great thing is that if you have a conversation with your interview guests that is exciting and enjoyable for you and your guests, then this vibe will most likely rub off on your listeners. So, try not to think of your interview guests as press spokespeople at a press conference who are asked questions that are really just about hard facts, but really try to create a pleasant atmosphere. It should sound like a pleasant conversation between a good friend or a colleague of yours with whom you simply want to talk about an exciting topic that you've always wanted to know about. With an on-site recording, simply imagine that you are sitting in a room, for example, in the break room, talking about an interesting topic, and think about what really interests you about this topic and how you would approach this topic with a person who is an absolute expert in this field. For a remote recording, you can simply imagine that you are Skyping or FaceTiming with a friend or acquaintance that you haven't seen for a long time, because the person may live in another country or something, and you would like to find out the most exciting, interesting, latest topics from this person in 30 minutes of interview time. I am very sure that if you approach an interview with this mindset, it will automatically sound much more natural, authentic, and relaxed. Tip number 2 goes in a similar direction, namely always think before the interview about what interests you most about the guest. And by that, I really mean you personally. Not necessarily what should be the main message of the interview, but really what is the most exciting topic for you personally when you think about the guest. Write this topic at the top of your sheet, at the top of the list of questions. And if you realize during the interview, for example, that the conversation is getting a bit boring, then you can come back to this topic. If you approach the topic with great enthusiasm, then the guest will also have the opportunity to come alive and tell you all their stories or share all their experiences with you. Then you will also notice how a completely different energy arises, because then it's no longer just about purely factual topics. It's really about what touches you personally about the subject. That may not be so easy with some topics. For example, when it comes to specialist subjects, I'm thinking of things like software or technical things in particular, but there are also certain topics that always fascinate people, which you might not think about at first. So always look at what you find fascinating about the other person you're talking to and make this topic a kind of central theme of your interview. What do I mean by that? So if the person you're talking to isn't very talkative and tends to thaw out a little more slowly by nature, then it can make sense to start with a relaxed introduction with a topic that doesn't go into really technical details straight away, but rather serves to make things a little more lively. Of course, this doesn't mean banal small talk topics such as the weather, but topics that are discussed a lot in your industry, for example, but which simply have a certain relaxed character. And there are a few formats for this that I always recommend, and I would like to briefly introduce 2 of them to you here. The first format is called Either Or. You may be familiar with this from some celebrity programs or entertainment television in general. They like to present people with certain terms and then let them decide which of the 2 terms they would like to choose. It can be really quite banal things like tea or coffee or something like that. If you want to be really relaxed or get up early or go to bed late, you could do things like that. Or if you want to bring in a bit more technical stuff, then it can also be things like Windows or Apple or radio or podcasts, things that cause a bit of controversy in your industry, which makes the guest position themselves a bit, but not too controversial, of course, because you don't want to scare anyone off at the beginning. But with these either-or questions, you get the guest to tell you something personal about themselves, to come out of their shell a little, and that also makes it easier to get into personal topics during the interview, or at least create a more personal atmosphere than if it's all about specialist topics right at the beginning. Another option is introduce yourself in 60 seconds. You may know that when you ask someone to introduce themselves personally, you often hear very long speeches that somehow start with their training or time at university, and then they end after the 10th job or so, depending on how long the person's CV is, and then you've already used up 3 minutes. And before the first really interesting substantive question comes, 5 minutes of the interview have already passed. And that's always a turnoff factor, of course. So it's a lot of fun to playfully set people a small time limit and say, please introduce yourself in 60 seconds. You can also add a bit of acoustic support by incorporating the sound of a ticking clock, for example, and then a bell at the end when the 60 seconds are up. That makes the whole thing a bit funny because many guests naturally try to pack a lot of information into a short time. Some don't manage it either. Then there's a funny little situation at the end when they realize they're running out of time, but most of them simply get to the point much more quickly and realize that they don't have to go on, but are also encouraged to tell a more lively and compact story. Tip number 4 relates to the questions for the interview. Many of my clients send me lists and documents before the interviews containing all the questions they want to ask during the interview. And that is, of course, very good because it shows that they have prepared themselves very well in terms of content and have really looked into the topic in depth. That is definitely an advantage. But ultimately, of course, this also makes it more difficult to react spontaneously in the interview if you have already pre-formulated questions that you then read out word for word, which can make the interview a bit stiff. And it's not so easy, for example, to spontaneously slip in another topic when it presents itself if you're always stuck with this list of questions. That's why I recommend writing down blocks of topics instead of specific questions, i.e. big overarching topics that you want to talk about and tick off as the conversation progresses. How you address them in the end is mainly up to the flow of the interview, so you can see what is currently being discussed. Is there perhaps a suitable transition here? If you take the first tip into account and conduct the interview like a natural conversation, then it will be very easy for you. This will automatically lead to a key topic that you had already planned for later, and you can move on to the next question. You can also mix specific questions with general topic blocks. This means that you write down a few specific questions and then simply add topic blocks in between. This way you still have a small guideline, you have something you can follow, but you still have a little more freedom in the design of the whole process than if you really only have questions that you have to work through. And tip number 5, storytelling. Talk about stories instead of just facts. What are we most interested in? When we hear news reports that are packed full of figures and statistics, that is, of course, very difficult to grasp unless you are an absolute numbers freak. If instead we hear a report about specific people who share a certain fate or to whom something exciting has happened, then we are naturally much more interested than if we only work with pure numbers, data, and facts. That's why it's very important to pay attention to good storytelling in podcast interviews. This can be achieved simply by asking the guest, "What was that actually like? Tell us, how did you feel in that situation?" We then move from this purely factual level to an emotional level, and many people then really start talking and tell their stories in vivid images instead of just going through the facts. And then a really lively story emerges that comes from the person and really captivates the listener. Those were my 5 top tips for making podcast interviews lively and authentic. And of course, I'm also very keen to hear your opinion on them. Feel free to write in the comments below how you organize your interviews. What tips might help you to make the interview a little more lively or a little more relaxed? And of course, if you'd like help with the production or conception of your podcast, then take a look at our website, kurtcreative.com. I've included the link below. We offer production services and advice on all aspects of podcasting. And if you don't want to miss a new video from us, then subscribe to this channel. Give us a thumbs up on the video so that we know it really resonates with you and is helpful.